as you're very well aware. That's created the global practices, which are areas of excellence to focus on specific areas. And Melinda, I might ask you to comment in a moment or two, but I personally have heard the GP senior directors and the directors signal to all their staff very, very clearly that they value the safeguards work that's done by staff within the bank, and they're doing a lot of good work to build up the culture and the value system in that respect. I don't know, Melinda, if you want to add anything specific, or are you happy with what I just said? Good. Thank you. Okay. The other point I wanted to mention is with regard to use of borrower frameworks. Certainly, it's going to be the case that in some countries we will be able to rely on the country framework a lot to deliver on the 10 standards and the directives and things that are behind them. But there will be a large number of countries where we will not be able to rely on the country system very much, if at all. So I just want to kind of manage that expectation that we, at the end of the day, have to decide as an institution whether we can rely on a country framework. That involves, as I mentioned, looking at what's in place in terms of the legislation and the processes and whatever, but also looking at the track record of the country in dealing with such issues. So this is a regulated process from our perspective, and where we propose to use aspects of a country framework, this will be disclosed in the PAD, in the project documentation related to that particular project, and stakeholders will have an opportunity to comment on our intended use of the framework.
Before I go to Kirsten's questions, just to add to what Mark was saying, it should also be clear that to Mohammed's point on would we be trapped into relying on a national sovereignty, that if we use a borrower framework, we remain accountable to be sure that that framework is consistent with the objectives that we've laid out in these standards. So that's something that I think we looked at very closely to be sure that these objectives were consistent with the principles that are embedded in the standard. So it's not simply a deferral to a system in toto. It's a system that has to enable us to ensure consistency with those objectives. Kirsten, you asked a question about why there's no reference to UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As your colleague Vicky, who's the rapporteur on UN Permanent Forum, has said in other situations, it's not a legally binding document. It's a declaration. And there are many, many declarations within the UN system that are relevant to our work. When we develop directives and guidance and other materials, these are areas where we can refer to declarations and resolutions that are not legally binding but are relevant to our work, where we can take these things into account. And that allows me also to refer to the human rights principles that you raised. What we have done with this framework is open up the space to take into account a whole range of information that was not explicitly provided for in the current set of safeguards. So by opening up the space about non-discrimination, relevant to a whole range of different groups, by opening it up to all of the human rights principles, we've opened up to taking into account information that's raised that are relevant to this broader scope of standards than we currently have. And that was similar to, because there had been a question before on ILO 169. Why not refer to ILO 169? Well, there's a convention that's been ratified by, I think, latest count, by 19 countries. We have a patchwork of ratifications. And even if you talk about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, there are a number of bank member states that either abstained or didn't sign on to it. So relevant, but we have to keep it, in the appropriate context, I think.
Maninder, you might want to just introduce yourself.
Yes. I'm Maninder Gill. I'm one of the 3 directors in the new global practice on social, urban, rural, and resilience issues, and I'm responsible for social development globally, including social safeguards. So very briefly on the implementation arrangements that Mark referred to, I think in terms of seriousness with which we take these issues, we've taken them extremely seriously for the past many, many years. So I wouldn't say that now we're going to take them more seriously, because I personally think, having come from that background, and you made a reference to, this being importance for staff in terms of career, so the fact that I could start 20 years ago as a social scientist working exclusively on resettlement to this position is also encouraging for other colleagues who work on safeguard issues. So these issues have been important for the institution for a long time. I think what is different in the global practice structure is that now we are enabling staff to be able to provide the best solutions for the benefit of the environment and affected people and communities. In the past, as you know, those of you who are familiar with our structure, we would have regional structure and the anchor. So if you are in a region, you basically rely on your 10, 15 colleagues who work on environmental or social issues within that region. By creating a global practice now, we've created mechanisms where, in my case, there are 200 social scientists who are in one community of practice, who discuss complex, challenging, difficult issues on a weekly basis and are able to come up with the best solutions for clients. We are also now able to deploy people from one, depending on the scale, complexity, scope of a project and safeguard issues, we can deploy people from anywhere in the world to where they are really needed. So if our top resettlement expert is in LAC, this doesn't mean that if you have a complex issue in East Asia, you're not able to deploy